Are you sure?
Here's the 30-second lesson on what legends know. Never ask a bride why she's getting married. Don't wear a skirt on a windy day. Deodorant is not a shower. Don't sniff chili flakes. And don't forget, saving is not investing. Legends don't just save, they invest in mutual funds. Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
A new government is about to be sworn in, and there are concerns over what I might call the C word. I know I'm being a little cheesy. This is a family channel. So C in this case stands for something that you hear about all the time these days, coalition, right? This episode of Karta Clutter is to give you precedents, data, lessons for us to understand what is the impact of coalitions, and are coalitions by their nature unstable, waffling, indecisive, even cowardly sometimes when it comes to issues of national security. What is the Indian experience? So while we are heading for another coalition government, is there a need to worry? Is there a need to be paranoid? Can we be excited? We'll talk on all of these issues, but not so much from our opinion or where we come from by way of prejudice, predilection, or what in Hindi we might call purvagrah. I just find that word is so difficult to translate accurately or aptly in English language. I like that word in Hindi, purvagrah. I'm sure there are equivalents in other languages also. The closest translation I would say is preconceived notions, something like that, but that's so prosaic in comparison. That is the reason we will go purely by fact. So first of all, we look at the economy. If you look at the economy, see this graphic on your screen. You will see this graphic in two forms because both of them are saying the same thing. So I'll show you the first one first, and then the second one. You like bar charts, you can see. You like to see a graded graphic, you can see a graded graphic. They are saying the same thing. So what are we doing? We are dividing India's political history. Since independence, we are dividing India's political history into three different epochs. So the first epoch is when we had total stability. That is 1947 to 1989. The same party ruled India, or one party ruled India with a full majority. There was a minor hiccup around 1979-80 when very briefly Charan Singh's government came in. Janata government didn't last long enough, but remember, it was a full majority single party government. It was not a coalition government. So 42 years of stability, perfect political stability. Not only were we ruled by one political party, but also that one political party was almost entirely owned by one political dynasty, barring a less than 2-year period between 1964 and January 1966, when Lal Bahadur Shastri was India's Prime Minister. This is just after Nehru's death and Indira's rise. Through this entire period of 32 years, this party was controlled by the Gandhi family, barring this little period between 1964 and January 1966. What did we get then by way of economic growth? See the first element in the graphic, that is 3.97% growth. Let's just say 4% growth. 4% growth. This is what Professor Raj Krishna, the noted economist of that era of the 70s, called it somewhat derisively and also self-deprecatingly as the Hindu rate of growth. Right now, this has become a very triggering word. And the moment you mention this, many people get upset, angry. These days, I think the word uses triggered, and they say this is demeaning to the Hindus, etc., etc., etc. Nevertheless, this is what Professor Raj Krishna said. And this is how Indian economic growth got characterized. So 1947 to 1989. So for these 42 years, CAGR, which people in the world of finance and economics know, but generally for all the rest of us also, CAGR is compound annual growth rate. What this means is that this is the average growth rate at which economy should have grown in this 42-year period to get to 1989 from where it was in 1947. That was less than 4%, 3.97. That was called the Hindu rate of growth. This is also the period when we actually did many other things. We did many things right in this country, most important being that we became stable and more stable and more stable and more secure, and we fought off wars in the 60s. All that's a given. But in spite of that, the fact is that between 1947 and 1977, 30 years, this includes the Garibi Hatao years in the year of Nehruvian and Indira socialism. In these years, poverty rate in India remained the same. The poverty rate remained the same, but the population doubled. As the population doubled and poverty rate remained the same, the number of absolute poor in India, that is the number of people below the poverty line, actually doubled in the first 30 years since our independence, years of perfect political stability. So that's a health check that we need. Then we come to the next epoch. If the first one was the epoch of stability, the second one is the era or epoch of coalitions, that is 1989 to 2014. If you go from 1989 to 2014, that's 25 years. The first era was 42 years. Second is 25 years. In that one, if you check carefully, your economy has actually grown much better. Your economy has grown at nearly 6%. In fact, if you go by the older method of calculation, the economy would have grown at 6.3%. I wrote a national interest on similar lines in 2018. This was written 6 years ago after National Security Advisor Ajit Kumar Doval delivered his Sardar Patel Memorial Lecture, in which he said India needs at least 10 more years of a full majority stable government. And I debated with him on that point, and I said, all right, you are entitled to a political wish, but this straight line correlation between a government being a majority government and a stable government and therefore more decisive government does not apply. And that's where I had used the data based on how economic growth was calculated until then, GDP. That would have come to 65. In any case, let's go by the new post-Modi era methodology. Even then, the growth rate in the era of instability or era of coalitions for a full 25 years is 5.8%. And then you come to the 10 years after that, again the Modi era, which is the era of stability, or the Modi epoch, the epoch of stability or return of stability. In that decade, again, the average CAGR is 5.1%. So this graph goes a bit like this and like this and a bit like this. Right now, okay, people will turn around and say, oh, but the Modi decade also had the year of COVID. Now there are two things there. One, every era, every government dealt with the calamity. The 60s had multiple wars, 62 with China, 65 with Pakistan, then 71 again with Pakistan. We had many years of famine and drought. It was before the Green Revolution came in. In the 50s, India was still settling the refugees who had come in from Punjab and from East Bengal. In the 70s, there were many other issues, including the sanctions regime. After the 1974 Pokhran tests, there was the emergency. So every decade and the tenure of every prime minister has seen crisis. Maybe not one as big as COVID, but COVID came and was gone in a year. If you think of Mr. Vajpayee's coalition faced more than one warlike situation, one limited war, that is Kargil, and second, a near warlike situation after Parliament attack in December 2001, after which Operation Parakram was launched. It also tested the nuclear weapons, in fact nuclear devices, and said these are nuclear weapons, as we know. And after that, it faced massive sanctions as well. So every ruler in the tenure of every prime minister has faced crisis. These crises get evened out over a period of time, particularly when you average it out over a 10-year period. So once again, the first 42 years, era of stability, 3.97%. The second era of instability, 25-year era of instability, 5.8%. And third, the period of the return of stability with a very strong government, controlled fully by one leader, and your growth now is at 5.1%. Now the trigger for this discussion today, I know the markets are smart. By this time, the markets have actually shed their anxieties and markets are coming back to normal and getting closer to the longer term fundamentals, which is a very good thing. But this discussion today is triggered by reports by many rating agencies. Now, the fact is, if the rating agencies were so wise, so many of the great collapses in the corporate world, particularly the financial world, would not have taken place in India itself. Even if you see one of the more recent massive collapses in Indian financial system, that is ILFS, what used to be called Infrastructure Leasing and Finance Services. It was a complete collapse. Then we saw Yes Bank also. But the fact is that in many of these cases, it is the rating agencies that let us down. We also saw that collapse of bond funds, AAA rated corporate debt, all of that was rated. Who gives AAA ratings? All of that was done by ratings agencies. But of course, in that universe, there is no real accountability. That's the reason I find it particularly, I might say, amusing, but at the same time also disturbing. The same rating agencies are now getting into the business of giving you political judgments as well, or assessing the quality of political governments depending on what the majorities are. So I've seen similar warnings by Moody's and by Fitch. Both need to do one thing. I'm not saying both need to get their head examined. They are much smarter than people like us. All they need to do is read some facts. Read some facts, check out India's political history, and if they do, then they will figure out two things. One, they will figure out, one, that their fears are misplaced, and the fears they are spreading are misplaced. I see from Moody's a line that says, and I quote, ambitious elements of reform agenda will be affected. So first of all, I would like to ask this rating agency, what are these ambitious elements of reform agenda? Please list these, and then we can have a further discussion on this in terms of the prospects of this going forward or not. And the second thing is, please cure yourself of the notion that the history of India and Indian politics began in 2014. The history of India, Indian politics, Indian democracy did not begin in 2014. Everything that's happening today, everything that's happened since 2014 is rooted in something that happened earlier. Maybe what that happened earlier wasn't good and it's now been junked, or it's been changed, or it's been improved. But to think that everything that we are seeing today has come only after 2014 is an error. Maybe a bunch of people who haven't seen so much, or who haven't read so much, or haven't had the time yet to read so much, or whose job it isn't yet to read things carefully, they can just look at Instagram reels and social media stuff and say, oh, everything we are seeing is happening for the first time. But for rating agencies and others to do this scaremongering and making these generalized statements, I would say go back to doing your basic work, that is rating of companies on their business practices and credit worthiness. Because if you look at India's political record, particularly the record of coalitions, the story is the opposite of what you seem to be peddling right now. That word peddling is deliberately used. Now, if you see India's prime ministers in the era of instability, 1989-2014, in the era of instability, India had 7 prime ministers or 10 prime ministerships, depending on how you count them. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, for example, became prime minister 3 times, once for only 13 days in 1996, then for about 11 months, and then for almost 5 years. It should have been 5 years. He himself advanced the elections by a few months. So 3 prime ministerships, if you count that as 3, and if you count Manmohan Singh as 2 because he had 2 terms as prime minister, then it becomes 10 prime ministerships in this 25-year period, or 7 prime ministers in this 25-year period. We've told you already that 25-year period saw the highest growth in India's history. Now we'll go into some details. You've seen the basic graphics, the 3-era comparison. Now you come to some detailed data. So see, the first graphic gives you the comparison for agriculture, forestry and mining across these 3 different eras. 47 to 89, full stability. 89 to 2014, coalitions, instability, 7 prime ministers, 10 prime ministerships, and then 2014 to 24, again return of full stability and 1 leader. So agriculture, forestry and mining. In this one, you will find that the graph actually moves in a very symmetric manner. The first perfectly stable era is low, the unstable era is higher, but the third era of stability, return of stability, is still higher. That I will tell you later comes mainly from agriculture. Agriculture has done quite well under Modi government in the 10 years of Modi government, particularly in the pandemic year and after. It seems like a lot of the laborers went back to their villages, they worked on their farms, and farming, if anything, remained completely unaffected by the pandemic. So this graphic is counterintuitive to the argument I'm making to you. But it's only one graphic, that is agriculture, forestry and mining. Also, Modi government has carried out some reforms in mining. It has opened up more areas for mining. Then you come to the second graphic, that is for manufacturing, construction, electricity, gas, and water supply. See what's happened there. The first era of stability is the lowest. Then in the era of instability, it goes the highest. And then it comes back in the Modi decade of the return of stability. So this large section, manufacturing, construction, electricity, gas, and water supply, the 25-year coalition era, saw the fastest growth. See, this graphic is in front of you. Then we come to our third one. That is trade, hotels, transport, communication. Once again, the same pattern as graphic 2, which means the lowest in the first phase of stability, about as much in the second phase of stability, that is the Modi decade, and the highest, considerably higher, in the 25 years of coalition rule. Fourth graphic in this series, finance, real estate, professional services. Again the same pattern. If this was the Olympic podium, medal podium, it will be 3, 1, 2. 1 in the middle. What's in the middle is 1989 to 2014. Then come to the fifth section, that is public administration, defense and other services. This means a lot of government spending on itself also. Once again, it's like an Olympic podium, 3, 1 and 2. 3 for the perfect stability 32-year period, 47 to 89. 2 for the stable Modi decade, 2014 to 24. And 1 for the supposedly unstable coalition era. In fact, it was an unstable era because so many governments changed. That's why we had 7 prime ministers and 10 prime ministerships in a 25-year period. Now I know the COVID year will continue to feature at the back of all your minds. The fact is that the growth had slowed down quite considerably even in the year before COVID. So 2019, the growth under Modi government was sub 4%. Now there were reasons given to this, and one of the reasons given was that UPA had left banks in a very bad state, and banks were struggling and they were not lending, and also bank balance sheet was short. This is what the chief economic advisor of that era, Arvind Subramaniam, called the double balance sheet problem. At the same time, every government has inherited problems. We can also examine the possibility, or we should also not ignore the possibility. Why should we discount the possibility? In fact, I think that's a very strong possibility, that the fact is that NDA had inherited the economy in a robust growth phase from UPA. And while the economy grew fast in the first 2 years, its momentum was completely broken by demonetization. Now, an action like demonetization, I am sure, could not have been taken by a coalition government. Will you call it a very decisive, bold action? Yes, it was a decisive, bold action. Will you call it a very wise, sensible action which has been vindicated by history and by the outcomes? No. So the argument is that if this was a coalition government where the leader had to consult others, had to game a decision, war game a decision before it was implemented, perhaps such an impediment would not have been created in the way of the economic growth by a government itself. So that demonetization of 2016 is one of the primary reasons this slowdown came. This is not to play down all the reform that has taken place under the Modi government. GST is a very big reform. The repair of the public sector bank balance sheets, the bankruptcy code, all of these are sizable reforms. The building of this massive physical infrastructure, easing up on mining, easing up on infrastructure building and clearances. All of these are major reforms, and our growth has come back to the 8% level. However, can it be anybody's argument that this was only possible under a full majority government? I will then give you some examples of reformist steps taken by non-majority governments as well. If you list for me the three most reformist budgets in India's history yet, for the first, everybody will say Dr. Manmohan Singh, 1991, right? What was the second? The second was P. Chidambaram in 97-98. Who was the Prime Minister? This was between Prime Minister Devagowda and Indra Kumar Gujral. These were governments on daily wages. These were governments where the party at the core did not even have 100 secure seats, right? And prime ministers were chosen by consensus among a minority group because this group was kept in power by a larger party outside. In this case, namely the Congress party. That is the government that gave us our second most reformist budget, the Chidambaram Dream Budget, as it was called. And this is the budget that lowered corporate taxes, marginal income taxes on individuals, greatly reduced customs duties, came out with voluntary disclosure of income scheme, set up the disinvestment commission, which ultimately led to the privatization and also listing of the big PSUs. And remember, this government had started, this is something that most people have forgotten, this government has started with two communists in the cabinet. It was the first and the last time in India's history yet that we've had leaders from the Communist Party as cabinet members. And these were not faltu cabinet positions. Indrajit Gupta was the Home Minister and Chaturanga Mishra was the Agriculture Minister. Then came the Vajpayee government. Vajpayee led three coalitions, 13 days, 11 months, and about 5 years. See the reforms they carried out. They are the ones who increased FTI limits in many areas. They came up with the new national telecom policy, ending the states, the government's monopoly in telecommunication. You can see, we all know the revolution that has brought about. They also increased FTI limits in banking and insurance, very vital. They sold 11 mostly profit-making PSUs. They also sold nearly 24 ITDC hotels. In fact, since then, it's been nearly impossible for anybody to sell any other hotel. Modi government, with all its power and majority for 10 years, has been able to sell only one PSU, that's Air India. Any other PSU it has sold to itself, like HPCL being sold to ONGC. So once again, this correlation that a stable, full majority government is able to take bolder economic decisions doesn't apply in many areas, because remember, a full majority stable government is also more risk averse because it has more to lose. Vajpayee coalitions also brought in the FRBM Act, Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, and after them the UPA in its two terms brought in value added tax, which ultimately morphed into Goods and Services Tax, GST. Vajpayee government had decided to privatize Delhi and Mumbai airports. That was a big reform. The UPA carried it forward. So Mumbai and Delhi became private airports. Private airports were built in Hyderabad, in Bangalore as well. In 2010, the UPA deregulated the petrol price. Then that reform was stymied and remained stymied for a long time. And even now that reform is subject to many discretions. You see how the petrol diesel price moves with the electoral cycle in India. So in these areas, whether you have a majority government or a coalition government, it doesn't really matter because politics goes on at all times. Now, how unstable can a government be? So among the most unstable governments we've seen was Chandra Shekhar's government. He was truly an accidental prime minister because VP Singh's government went out. And for a brief while, Chandra Shekhar was put in power with Congress saying, we'll support you from outside. He had just about 50 MPs. In fact, his critics would then call it the government of Ali Baba and Chalis Chor, right? Kind or unkind, that's how his government was described. It is something I might have mentioned to him a few times and he would laugh. But look at the kind of things he did. To save India from a default, he is the one who flew out India's gold to be kept overseas as guarantee. It wasn't sold, to kept overseas as guarantee so India would not suffer a default. He protected India's economy and prestige at that time when he just had 50 MPs with himself and he was mostly kept in power by the Congress party outside. He also saw the crisis in India's economy, so he brought in Yashwant Sinha as his finance minister the first time in politics, and he brought in Dr. Manmohan Singh as an advisor to the finance ministry in a position where he could start attending the cabinet meetings. So when Narasimha Rao government followed, Dr. Manmohan Singh was already ready to carry out the big reformist actions. Dr. Manmohan Singh and Yashwant Sinha then became the two engines of reform in the coalition era. That started in the Chandra Shekhar era. And then after that came up P. Chidambaram under Deve Gowda as well. Remember, at that point, P. Chidambaram was not in the Congress party. He was in a small new party called TMC, or Tamil Manila Congress, not TMC as in Trinamool Congress. That came in much later. Now, we mostly talked about the economic side. What about the strategic side, foreign affairs? See the decisions some of the so-called weak governments have taken. Mrs. Gandhi's government, Indira Gandhi's very strong government in 1974, when she carried out Pokhran 1, she called it a peaceful nuclear explosion. Now you can say the global situation was a bit different. She was not bold enough to call it a nuclear weapon test. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, in a weak coalition in 1998, tested nuclear weapons in Pokhran 2, and proclaimed India to be a nuclear weapon state. How unstable was this coalition? It was voted out within 11 months, voted out by one vote. We remember that story in early May of 1999. So once again, strong decisions on the strategic side can be taken by weak coalitions as well. Coalitions, why does a coalition have to be weak or strong? By coalition governments. The same coalition government which had now become caretaker after losing power fought the war in Kargil, and the entire political system went along with this. Subsequently, the same coalition government took us nearly to war with Pakistan in Op Parakram and then moved a massive peace process with Pakistan as well. So once again, not having a majority government was not a constraint. Narasimha Rao's government, as we know, carried out the first big post-Cold War correction in our foreign policy by upgrading India's relations with Israel and exchanging ambassadors with that country. That was one very important step. Chandra Shekhar, with his government of 50 MPs and many outsiders, and really a temporary government, everybody knew it was a government on daily wages. He permitted US military aircraft to refuel in India from Diego Garcia, mostly from Diego Garcia, going on to the Gulf War. This is after Saddam Hussein's occupation of Kuwait. Now, it is true that this was UN mandated, but any Indian government usually would have been shy of doing it, majority or not majority, it would not have mattered. And finally, if you come to UPA, if Pokhran 1 to some extent, but Pokhran 2, if Pokhran 2 was the boldest strategic move made by India, the boldest strategic statement made by India. The second boldest statement was the signing of the India-US nuclear deal, because that completely changed the paradigm, shifted the paradigm of Indian foreign policy and India's worldview, or where India saw itself positioned in the world. Who did that? It was done by, again, quote-unquote, weak UPA government. At that point, the BJP opposed it. Subsequently, as Mr. Modi came to power, this was hailed as a great blessing for India, and he took this process forward. So what is the larger lesson as we again move into a coalition government, into coalition era? This is the return to coalition era. The larger lesson is a coalition is unstable, but it forces our leaders to negotiate, trade for space, listen to others, fish in a larger talent pool. A secure majority government makes politicians complacent. However, secure majority governments have many virtues as well, but I am also counting the negatives. A secure majority government makes politicians complacent, self-indulgent, arrogant, and these create unsustainable personality cults. Indira to Rajiv to Modi too, that is the lesson of India's political history. And that is why we need not be afraid of coalitions, and that's why we should be actually quite happy that a new coalition government is coming in. Having said that, in conclusion, I will just tell you one piece of statistics, one data point. Narendra Modi-led BJP's score in this parliament, that is 240 out of 543. Today the House is 543, is exactly 44.2%. 2%. That is the percentage of seats he's got. It's a bit below 50%, 44.2%. What is the score that Narasimha Rao had in 1991 in that election? He got 232 seats in the House then of 523. 232 in a House of 523. What percentage was that? 44.3%. So it's exactly the same percentage of seats then that Modi has now. It is with that minority, he did not even build a coalition. It was with that minority that he ruled for 5 years. And it's with that minority government that he brought in the most dramatic reform in our economy. In fact, when we think of Narasimha Rao's reform, we remember Dr. Manmohan Singh's budget. But the big thing with that reform was abolition of license quota Raj. How did that happen? That did not happen in the budget. That declaration of the new industrial policy, abolishing quotas, licenses, etc., or the abolition of license quota Raj, that was made in same parliament just before the presentation of the budget, the same day by the industry minister. And would any of you remember who was the industry minister? Kocha. It was Narasimha Rao himself. He was the industry minister. So the Prime Minister himself as industry minister first came and lifted the license quota Raj. After that came Dr. Manmohan Singh's budget.